And so it went on, the sadder the better. Baumer used to be a master at the art of drawing elegiac melodies out of his simple instrument. Those of us who did not know the words kept humming the melodies, except for the alter, whose mood had changed, and who was leaning back with a deeply troubled look on his face. All of a sudden he got up and quietly said, "Stop it now. I won't have more of it." "Hey, alter, don't be a bore. Let's have some more songs," Schmidtchen shouted, intoning another melody. "I said stop it!" the alter roared, banging the flat of his hand down on the table. "Curfew now! Tomorrow we'll have our hands full of repair work on the roof. Time to turn in." With that, he left and prepared for his round in the trenches. Before Schmidtchen could further object, Heinrich quickly grabbed his arm, forcing him to understand that it was better not to insist. Our little party was over. The alter was gone. Heinrich was due for the next guard tour and sat by the fire. I was curious about the alte's strange behaviour and asked Heinrich what he knew of it. "Well," he said, "seems he can't stand these kitchen songs. They get him down." And then he told me the story of Sala and the alte's role in it. He said sooner or later I would hear of it anyway, at least hints or indications which would make me wonder, so it was just as well if he told me now. The alte was with the combat group that had been the predecessor of our division. Pulled out of the south of Norway, they were thrown to the new front in North Karelia in June 1941, when the campaign up here started. As a motorized unit, entirely unprepared for combat in the woods, their first mission was to take some hills in the wilderness between the Finnish-Russian border and the hamlet of Sala. It was terrain that should have been identified as the stronghold it actually was if there had been proper reconnaissance, but to safeguard the operation's surprise, none had been allowed. So hardly had they advanced to the foot of the hills when they were cut down by the Russian Mungos and machine guns blasting away from their bunkers on high ground. Our men were pinned down under the enemy's fire. In no time, the dry forest began to burn. Heinrich wasn't with the unit then, but he was told it was dreadful. Roaring fire and smoke filled the area, mortar shells exploded, and scattered machine gun fire caused more and more casualties among men and officers. Communications had collapsed. Before long, they panicked and retreated. The alter, aware he might burn to death himself, left his comrades behind, either wounded or dead. After Sala had been taken, the dead were recovered, hundreds of them. The alter was still haunted by his buddies' cries for help in the burning wood. Heinrich finished the story and put some more wood on. His profile was silhouetted by the fire. The account of the grim truth of the division's baptism of fire added to the sombre expression that used to mark his pale, narrow face with the dark eyes. We had talked before and had become kind of close. Born in Königsberg in East Prussia, he had volunteered right after leaving the gymnasium. But for all his idealism, he was a skeptic who took some satisfaction in telling me, the new replacement, that the division's combat record wasn't entirely glorious. After a while he continued, "The division fought with distinction thereafter and was reorganized as a mountain division in 1942. The alter got the Iron Cross. He isn't over it, though, and I doubt he'll ever be." I was to relieve Heinrich on guard at midnight, so it was time to get some sleep. I climbed up into my bunk and fixed the twigs and the boughs from the parcel to the logs of the wall. The roof had been patched up for the time being. In the morning we would begin with the repair behind a camouflage screen that had to be put up before daybreak. It must have been around that time that I became acquainted with Untersturmführer Manhard. I was on guard, waiting for my relief to come. More snow had fallen, the sky had cleared, and it became bitterly cold. We had slipped into that season when nature goes numb with cold, and when the men on both sides fight the frost as their common enemy. Even minor negligence could cause frostbite on the extremities, ears, and noses. On guard, standing on layers of twigs of spruce, we were clad in felt boots, padded trousers, fur-lined anoraks, snow shirts, huge mittens, our heads protected by a woolen mask with holes only for the eyes and mouth, looking like fat market women rather than young soldiers. Beyond such hardships, though, There were winter days and nights when this strange land presented itself in great glamour. I had already seen northern lights of immaculate beauty, a huge gleaming, dancing, wavering and flickering of marvellous forms and colours, captivating us earthbound dwarfs and belittling our belligerent doings. At noon on that day, the sun had, for a short time, risen above the horizon and made the snow glitter and sparkle, even around the dead Russian's upright arm by the wire entanglement. On his round through the trench, Shaper was about to leave our gun emplacement when he told me I was to see Manhard in his bunker on my return from duty. "Seems to be personal," he said. I wondered what it could possibly be. As it turned out, he and Shaper had been in our bunker before to talk to the Alta. There he had spotted my Hamsun book left on the table and inquired to whom it belonged. "I'm very glad to have someone in the neighbourhood who reads Hamsun," he said with a handshake after I had reported to him. I saw him the first time without his helmet or cap. Immediately I thought of Philip, a different face, same type. On his tunic he wore the EK1 and the Verwundetenabzeichen, which was very unusual. "Have you read more of him?" "Growth of the Soil," I replied. "I'm very fond of it." "So we've something in common," he said. "Sit down and tell me about yourself." I briefly told him about my background and learned he was from Munster, Westphalia. He asked me to lend him my Hamsun, saying that there was a special reason for his interest. He was going to be assuming command of a company of the Division Reconnaissance Battalion up on the north flank, where they would be operating together with the Norwegian volunteers. I wasn't aware of Norwegians in our division, and my curiosity was aroused. He explained they had volunteered for the cause of Finland, first forming a company and then, having grown to a full battalion, SS Skijäger Battalion Norge, Norway. They were experts on skis and fully mastered that inhospitable terrain. The north flank was about 30 kilometres north of our location, Manhard said, with no coherent front line but merely a few outposts and strong points of various sizes. These were built for all-around defence, with lots of ammunition and rations, all spread out over a vast terrain of swamps, lakes, woodlands and some forlorn huts. Warfare in that region primarily meant patrolling the no-man's land. He had been stationed there before he went to the officers' candidate school and was familiar with the terrain. All that fired my imagination. Noticing my interest, Manhard casually remarked, "Sounds like you are interested in joining one of those patrols." "Sure, why not?" I said idly, not knowing that this was to have important consequences. In the course of March 1944, with the sun steadily climbing up the meridian each day, the reconnaissance activities in the division's sector increased. 12 hours of daylight, frozen lakes, and the snowbound terrain were ideal conditions for Gebirgsjäger, mountain infantry, ski patrols. It was particularly crucial on the north flank for the survival of the outposts and of the division as a whole to track down the enemy, concealed somewhere in the wilderness, and to find and destroy his bases. The winter had not been as hard as the last few had been. In our bunker we had survived quite safely, and yet, looking back, it seems impossible that a front line could be maintained in such extremely hostile climatic conditions. However, the bunkers were much improved dugouts with several layers of logs on top, proof even against heavy artillery fire, and thus provided relatively comfortable shelter as well. The adverse effects on morale of constant darkness from November until February were eased by the battalion schnapps, a clear white booze issued quite lavishly once a week. The long hours inside were spent with 17-4, a poker-like game with heaps of rubles involved, the currency of our pay, with which we could do absolutely nothing else. I think what enabled us to get through the winter fairly well was our youth and a certain spirit of bravado. Of course, as youths we were always hungry, and our hunger was beyond the capacity of any rationing system to satisfy. No doubt the constant nervous strain added to our hunger. Most of us were so keen on sweets that when we got our weekly ration of mixed fruit jam, we devoured it at full tilt early that month. I was called to the company command post, where I was informed that I was going to be transferred to SS Reconnaissance Battalion 6 Nord, deployed on the north flank. Whether Manhard had pulled some strings with the division staff, I never found out. My feelings about it were mixed. On one hand, I would miss the comrades in the Altes squad, Heinrich in particular. On the other hand, I was trained especially for ski patrols and felt I was more at home in the open, even in this inhospitable region, than in the trenches and bunkers. At any rate, it is not least for another encounter with the wild geese that I think the long-range ski raid in that season belongs to my portrait of the volunteers. The flight of the geese followed the call of nature as we thought we were destined to follow our mission in the near Arctic north. A few days later, I was on a truck rumbling along the road to the north. This road had been cut out by our engineer battalion across the hills and swamps of the wilderness, some 10 kilometres distant from and parallel to the front line, a massive corduroy road of tree trunks and planks. It was the counterpart of the railway on the Russian side, and the difference between them symbolised the gross disadvantages with which our own logisticians had to cope. The road ended at a lakeside that was still and frozen, sporting a few sheds and 2 overturned boats, a place of infinite loneliness. A sleigh brought us eastward across the lake. On the other edge, a small settlement of log cabins emerged from the white surroundings. It served as the base of the reconnaissance battalion's front line, which blocked the passage between 2 other lakes some kilometres further east. When I reported to the command post, I learned that I was assigned to Manhard's company. As it turned out, 3 ski patrols were to start in parallel in a few days. They were to operate independently and were led by 3 officers, Manhard, a Norwegian officer, and, to my great surprise, von Hartmann. With a 3-squad total of 32 men, 2 NCOs and 1 officer, our group was the smallest, with 1 squad consisting of Norwegian volunteers. We were assigned to search for the enemy in the Russian rear echelon, take prisoners and return immediately, while the others would be out for 2 days reconnoitring north and south. Our preparations were already well underway. I got skis and Finnish ski boots, but kept my own rifle. About half of the group was armed with submachine guns. Several Akyas were being loaded with ammunition, rations, among others a specialty for reconnaissance parties, a mixture of nuts, almonds and raisins, tents and spare skis for the prisoners we were to take. We were to depart shortly after dusk, hoping to hunt down the enemy behind their lines by the next morning. We assembled at 0700. Manhard had a Russian submachine gun with several round magazines, an indestructible, never-failing, most coveted weapon. We wore no helmets, our mountain caps being more expedient on a mission like this. It took us another half hour to reach our positions for departure. We conducted a short pause and then slipped in single file through the safe lane in the minefield out into no man's land, which lay in semi-darkness under a clear night sky. The Russians, we supposed, were operating in an area between 2 lakes that were about 10 and 12 kilometres east of our HKL. Our route was planned as a wide arc around that area, leading into their rear. The patrol was not unfamiliar with the terrain. We had maps that showed the lakes, they were numbered, the rivers and the flat hills, giving us a general idea of the marshes. Experience from previous patrols added to our sense of familiarity. Some spots, I learned, were marked to indicate where comrades had been killed in an earlier action and had to be left behind. Later, in the huge vastness and desolation of the region, I never quite lost the feeling that no human being had ever before trodden on the ground we were crossing. We traversed thin woodland and open expanses, worked through thick undergrowth, and had to get over ditches and frozen water. Rocks and fallen trees had to be bypassed, and sometimes we would go smoothly along our track. The Akyas were drawn in rums. The tour was laborious, and we sweated in spite of the cold. After months in the trenches, I was out of shape. Now and again the patrol would come to a halt when the terrain in front had to be secured in preparation for our passage. At such times there was an utter stillness, so absolute you could hear your own heartbeat and feel the rush of blood in your ears. We paused around midnight, assembling by a small glade in a mixed stand of birches and spruce. Here we were relatively secure, so that each squad could kindle a small fire for tea, the way the Finns had taught us. We used cylindrical cans with holes poked through the sides just above the bottom. Strips of bark from birch trees were thrown in and kindled, while chips of birch wood kept the fire burning steadily and almost smokeless. It was sufficient to provide us with a warm drink. The men stood around, talking in low voices. Above, the sky formed a huge glittering vault, and I reflected that we didn't have that sort of sky at home. I was talking to Herweg, the squad leader of the Norwegians, who had been with Manhard on missions before and seemed to be particularly devoted to him. Suddenly Manhard was standing by us, pointing overhead. "Listen, hear that?" he asked, listening raptly. "Be quiet for a moment," he said to the men. Then I heard the trumpet-like cries of geese, high up, still far off, but coming nearer. All of us were listening now and looking up. A wide, triangular formation of birds appeared against the sky, rushing from the south to the north and singing their shrill, plaintive, endless song. We watched the birds until they vanished in the dark. Again, I could not help thinking of the song we had sung so often in the Jungvolk. Wildgänse rauschen durch die Nacht, mit schrillem Schrei nach Norden. Unstätte Fahrt, Habacht, Habacht, was ist aus uns geworden? Fahr zu, Jahr zu, du graues Heer, fahr zu, Jahr zu, nach Norden, und Jahren wir ohne Wiederkehr, rauscht uns im Herbst dein Namen. Trying to express my feelings in that moment, I think it was then that I began to regard the wild geese as an image of our own mission, of our fight against Bolshevism in this forlorn region, as natural and inevitable a thing as the flight of the birds. No doubt the song was also in the minds of many of us, much as we were focused on our task to operate out there on our own in the enemy's rear. We did not then see, however, the prophecy in the lines of the song, the prophecy of things that had happened but were unknown to us, and of things to come. We went on to cross the land in an easterly direction. In the dark, there was no sign of the enemy. In single file, we laid our track without disturbing the silence of the woods. There was only the soft noise of the gliding skis and the rhythmic clicks of the poles muffled by the snow. As the hours went by, the strain increased. There seemed to be no beginning and no end to the white vastness. Only sparse trees filled the void, trunks standing upright in defiance of their hostile habitat. Before dawn, we took another rest. Manhard consulted with the two squad leaders over a map lit by a flashlight. Turning southwest, we were bound to cut across the Russian lines of communication sooner or later. With first light, all our movements grew more cautious. There were more stops at the front, more surveying of the terrain with binoculars, and more security measures. At about 1,000 hours, we approached Lake No. 20, some 6 kilometers south of our night's route. At a signal from Manhard, we took cover in the snow. In front of us, the lake formed a smooth white expanse amid the woodland. Manhard and the squad leaders swept again over the terrain with their binoculars. Suddenly, at last, they spotted the enemy. We heard distant voices. We moved forward, and then I saw them, a Russian detachment going eastward across the lake, while, from its eastern edge, a detail with 2 horse-drawn sleighs and several men came out of the woods to meet them. Manhard motioned us further back into the forest, where we took a turn toward the northwestern corner of the lake, paralleling the lake shore and the Russian line of communications. Meanwhile, the 2 Russian groups met in the middle of the lake and proceeded westward together. We arrived early enough at the western edge for Herweg's Norwegians to slip unnoticed across Ivan's track and to move into a concealed position in the woods, while Manhard's squad took an opposite position. The 3rd squad remained in reserve. Slowly and quite at ease, the Russians approached. Manhard let them come up to a distance of 50 meters and then shouted at them in Russian, "Hands up! Throw away all weapons!" They chose not to comply. After some confusion, their answer was a hail of small arms fire in our direction, meant for an enemy they did not see. They had taken cover behind their sleighs and kept firing. We had gotten rid of our skis, dispersed on the edge of the lake, and held our fire as we prepared to attack. Then Manhard, kneeling by a trunk and observing the Russian group through his binoculars, gave his orders loudly and clearly. Under his lead and the covering fire of our riflemen, The men with the submachine guns stormed forward, forming a cordon. The snow prevented them from running, so they took their time and rushed ahead in short jumps, taking cover in the snow between jumps while we held down the Ivans with our rifle fire. The poor devils had no chance. Soon their fire became weaker, although some of them kept bravely defending themselves. Our men were so near now that we had to stop our fire. Manhard's squad had already made it to the last sleigh and appeared behind the Russians. A few more burps from submachine guns, and it was over. We stood up. One of the Norwegians was leading one Russian, hands raised, back to our position. As it turned out, he was the only one who survived. There were no casualties on our side. Slowly our men returned. Among the dead Russians was the commander of a ski battalion, which explained their stiff resistance. After securing the papers and documents he had on him, we found the sleighs loaded with rations. There was no time to be lost. Although the fight had lasted no more than 20 minutes, it must have alarmed the whole Russian rear echelon. We took off, heading toward Lake No. 17 to the northwest, where we were expected by von Hartmann's group. Unfortunately, our brave prisoner turned out to be a hopeless failure on skis, so we did not make too much progress. Once in a while, however, we left a few landmines underneath our track, a wise precautionary measure, as we noticed with satisfaction when we heard an explosion behind us about an hour after we started. We reached von Hartmann's position early in the afternoon. Although by then we had been on our way for almost 20 hours, we had another 3 hours to go. A detail of von Hartmann's group joined us on our way back. On 2 Akias, they were drawing a sad load. 3 Jaegers killed in a previous battle were found the way they had been left early that winter. Now, enveloped in canvas, they were returning for burial in our cemetery. The main force of von Hartmann's group stayed behind to intercept a Russian combat unit they assumed was operating in the area. For us, having performed the main part of our mission, the tension eased off. But almost 24 hours of skiing, interrupted only by the fight at Lake No. 20, left us physically exhausted. About 1 hour had passed when we heard intense small arms fire from behind. Von Hartmann must have met the enemy somewhere around Lake No. 17. After a while the noise ceased. We wondered if that had been all there was. Indeed, late in the afternoon we heard the noise of another clash. This time it sounded more serious and didn't stop as quickly. We heard discharges and impacts of heavy mortars. Now we knew von Hartmann's group was in real trouble. We reached our lines safely. Von Hartmann's group returned late the next day. Of the 30 men, 5 had been killed and 15 wounded. They bedded their dead, covered with canvas, in a row of AKs in front of the cabin where I arrived a few days before. Among them was von Hartmann. The news spread like wildfire. He was killed by a direct mortar shell hit. The 2 days of rest we were granted afterward were clouded by von Hartmann's death. Certainly the casualties of the Russians had been by far heavier, but it was the general opinion that we had paid a high price. For me, von Hartmann's death was a personal loss. I had lost the very model of what I thought a modern officer should be. I had watched him inspecting his group on the day before our departure, his easy, affable way with the men. He had lost his limp, but was still using his stick. From that moment, the north flank had seemed to me brighter and somehow familiar. I had hoped there would be an opportunity to speak to him, and when I heard the news of his death, I felt, for a moment, forsaken. It was another step in the process of becoming a seasoned soldier. On one of these days, Manhard asked me to come by the cabin he stayed in. He still had my book and wanted to give it back. We sat down on 2 stools and made ourselves comfortable in front of a fire in the crude, whitewashed fireplace that formed the centre of the cabin. The rest of the furniture was of the simplest kind. Earlier in this house of roughly hewn logs, people had lived their lives, a whole family most likely, now gone, evacuated together with their small herd of livestock. What was left was still a pastoral setting of utter simplicity and innocence. "This is straight from Hamsun's world," Manhard said. "The world of blessing of the earth. Isaac's and Inga's first house at Sellenra must have been like this." His remark did not require confirmation. For a while we let the fire do the talking, our thoughts lingering around the strangeness of the situation. The war had placed both of us into this environment so different from our own, and yet so familiar to us through that Nordic novelist's work. Manhard was in a sombre mood, however, and needed someone with whom he could talk. It wasn't only von Hartmann's death he had to get over. He also grieved about the recent bombing of his hometown in Westphalia, which was almost totally destroyed, including his family's home. He said the war was no longer only about destroying the enemy's military power, but also about annihilating their cities and the people living there. And it wasn't even two different cultures doing that to one another. It was old Europe bombing itself to pieces. If that would go on, he said, Europe would be easy prey for the Red Army. Asked about my own family, I told him that the house on the wall in Brunswick had recently been destroyed too, its beautiful facade, Issa's Elysium, burned to the ground, all rubble now. I spoke of my mother's last letter writing about my little brother Peter now being a Luftwaffenhelfer and staying at a flak emplacement near Brunswick. He became the fourth soldier in the family, with my father serving in Italy and my elder brother Nick at the Army Officers' Candidate School in Soissons, France. It wasn't much consolation. At that time, the Allies had already adopted the unconditional surrender formula, which, we realized in our talk, left us no choice. Now it was either destruction for us or for them. Our mission up there, we found, was all the more clear. Hold the ground against the Bolsheviks as long as possible. Manhard thought our cause wasn't yet lost. His hope was founded on what he called a new European spirit coming into being, shared by our brothers in arms, the Finns, our Norwegian comrades, and by all the other volunteers serving in our ranks from France, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even Switzerland. I told him how much I agreed, and that this vision had brought me to join the troop with Philip's help. My casual remark that Philip now was serving with the Wiking Division alerted him instantly. "Why?" he said. "I came from the Viking to the Nord after I was released from the hospital. I was still an NCO then." We talked a while about that division, and then I said I was curious whether he had earned his Iron Cross First Class there and what for. "That's right," he said. "I got it from the Viking in the hospital. I had destroyed 5 Russian tanks. It was pure chance. No one else was there to do it. The tanks stood in a row obliquely to my anti-tank gun and couldn't turn against me, at least not as quickly as they got busted, one after another." He played it down. We watched the flames and put some more wood on the fire. Despite the difference in rank and my great respect for him, we had become closer in mutual interests and shared beliefs. There were nearly 2,000 Swiss volunteers in Wallaley too on the German side, most of them serving in the Waffen-SS. From summer 1942, in general, they were posted to the 6th SS Gebirgsdivision Nord, see Winkensgürtel, Schweizer Freiwillige and Deutsche Zeit, Zurich, 1997, 561, 638. I was back with my battalion before Easter. The regiment had requested my return when the leader of another heavy machine gun crew in our platoon had been killed by a sniper. I was to replace him. It meant a different position, a different squad, and a different bunker, even different equipment. Now I had a submachine gun and a pistol instead of a rifle. The new machine gun emplacement, north of my former position, had as its field of fire a wide expanse with a few thin stands of trees. The Russian positions were rather far off, their front line receding northward to meet the eastern inlet of Lake No. 70. Here the ground was flat and in summer swampy, with only a few small elevations, or ribs, as we used to call them. The lower stretches of the trenches, connecting my former position with the new one, were no more than shallow ditches, providing only the most inadequate protection. Here, in the sharp light of a sunny morning, my predecessor had met his sudden death. I looked forward to my new assignment, not least because I knew I would find Stricker there, my South Tyrolean comrade from the training camp. Thanks to him, I had a warm reception in the new bunker when Shaper, our platoon leader, introduced me to the men. Stricker was the No. 2 gunner in the squad. No. 1 was Bing, an Alsatian, another one of the old guard, a veteran of Sala. In the course of time, he turned out to be a gunner of unfailing calm and cold-bloodedness in the most precarious situations, no matter whether he had been drinking or not. One of the riflemen was Otto Berger, a Bavarian worker's son. He cherished an ardent devotion to the Führer and regarded him as the saviour of his family. As he told me some time later, in tears after quite a few glasses of booze, his family had been saved from misery, despair and humiliation when his father's long-term unemployment ended in the course of Hitler's first job creation program. It was early in April. The ground was still covered with snow, but as it was past the vernal equinox, dawn came at an almost normal hour of the day. I was on guard duty in the machine-gun bunker. Above the still frozen land, the sky arched into a huge vault. From the horizon in the southeast, an array of separate flat cloud banks, broadening in perspective, extended up to the zenith in peaceful immobility. Dawn was waning and, in a subtle change, was giving way to daylight. First, a pale pink appeared between the dark firs in the east, and then it gradually changed into a deep orange, which slowly spread over the sky. Against this glow, the cloud banks turned dark violet first, then lavender and green, and eventually serene saffron. I peered across our sector, now lying in full daylight. Sweeping the rabbit-eared trench scope slowly across the enemy's position, I stopped at the Russian machine gun emplacement opposite from us. There I saw two fur-capped figures moving about. I could only see their heads, first popping up from behind the parapet and then dimly behind the embrasure. The two Russians were practicing on their gun, rather carelessly, in fact. The sight of them, so much enlarged in my sight reticule, was something of a sudden confrontation, the more so as the clear weather allowed me to get a distinct impression of their features. I mused, so here were two of the red hordes sent by the Bolsheviks to overrun our Occidental culture, people who had turned churches into pig stalls. Seeing them at close range, they looked strange, foreign, uncivilized, and, yes, frightening. But then, they belonged to a Soviet ski brigade that was one of their best units, as far as we knew. Hadn't these people, or at least their older brothers or parents, filled their magnificent churches with their wonderful voices not too long ago? Hadn't their powerful and deeply moving anthems, never heard in German church choirs, been sent as praise to the same God to whom we prayed at home? And didn't Tchaikovsky's symphonies, which I loved so much, have their roots in these people's souls? I was torn from my thoughts when two officers, accompanied by Schaeper, entered my emplacement. One of the two was Manhard's successor with the 12th Company down from the Junkerschule, Waffen-SS officer candidate school, only recently. The other one I recognized by the 3 silver pips and the 2 braids on his left collar. It was Hauptsturmführer Hansen, our battalion commander, whom I faced then for the first time. The battalioner, as we used to call him, was, from all I had heard of him, a highly respected, very popular commander. He was respected for his vigorous leadership and proven bravery, and popular for his friendly way with the men. Now I thought his appearance and manner met all the qualities I had heard of, but he struck me as young, much younger than I had thought. He accepted my report, saluted, and immediately stepped up to the telescope where he began searching the enemy's positions. From time to time he talked to the officer of the 12th, pointing to some of the positions. Then, straightening up, he seemed to have confirmed his decision about a mission they apparently had discussed in detail before. The mission was to be started across the no-man's land in front of us that same night. It was a combat patrol. Later, Schaeper turned up to ask me to go out with the patrol and secure their left flank with my gun. Outside it was dark, early in the morning of the day of our patrol. The air in the bunker was hot and loaded with the pungent smell of burning wood and glowing cigarettes, of leather and wet things. The men were standing close around the carbide lamp, so that the room was darkened by their shadows. Tightly packed under the low ceiling in the cramped room, they wore white-covered helmets and had stowed away their equipment with belts and straps on the white anoraks. The men of the assault team carried as many hand grenades and as much ammunition for their automatic weapons as they could manage. The 3 of us, Bing, Stricker and I, had slung ammunition belts over our shoulders. I was holding our MG-34 pressed to my body. I was my own #1 gunner this time. Silence had fallen on the room. All was set. The mission was clear. An assault group would breach the Russian positions opposite us, penetrate their bunker system, and return with prisoners before dawn. Now everyone was more or less occupied with keeping his uneasy feelings under control. I, for one, kept telling myself, "We are an excellent team. We have excellent leadership. It can be done if we are smart enough. Don't worry, and for heaven's sake stay cool." I watched the stern, inscrutable faces of the men, which were occasionally illuminated by the glow of a cigarette. A group of 4 were standing by the exit, strangely separated, the hoods of their anoraks drawn over their helmets. They carried no weapons, but each had fastened to his chest several kilograms of explosives. They were a detachment from the regiment's penal platoon, and were given the opportunity to redeem themselves in combat. These were men who had committed some infraction of military discipline, such as laxity while on guard duty, drunkenness, insubordination, or some offence in the rear, such as the misappropriation of government property or harassment of a girl. Their mission was to pick up the mines, to make a path across our own mine belt, and to clear the way for the demolition team in front of the enemy bunker line. At that moment I found their presence, their mission, and their unarmed status deeply disturbing, as one could sense the grim enforcement of military discipline. Their presence added to the gloom in the bunker. At a sign from their leader, a combat engineer sergeant, they left the bunker to begin their work. We stayed behind for what seemed to us another eternity. Our patrol leader looked at his watch. "It's time. Let's go." Relieved, we took up our gear and pushed to the exit, first the assault team, then us, the support element. Passing the stove, we flung our cigarettes into the fire and made for the trench. At the exit to the cleared path through the minefield stood the battalioner, making a remark now and then to a man he knew by name, or just briefly lifting his hand in an informal salute. When I came by, he gave me a smile, perhaps remembering our encounter that morning in our emplacement. The 3 of us reached our position unnoticed, and I fixed the gun in firing position behind a fallen trunk. To the left lay the bare expanse. In front, at a distance of about 70 meters, was the Russian main combat position. I could dimly recognize the dark rectangle of the embrasure of their machine gun emplacement in the snowbound bunker line I had had in my sight that morning. I adjusted my gun over the foresight. Wham! Wham! There were 2 flashes ahead to our right, directly in front of the enemy position. Wham! The 3rd charge went off. The assault team was jumping ahead toward the Russian ditch. A flare went up. Seconds later, the Russian machine gun burst into life. The same moment, I sent half a belt with some tracers directly through the embrasure. The recoil of my gun hammered into my shoulder, and the bipod rattled from the force of the bursts. Our fire silenced the Russian gun just in time for our engineers to dash through its field of fire. More Russian flares soared up. Now the Russian machine gun fired again. After another burst from our gun, though, our demolition team managed to throw a 3-kilo charge into the embrasure. A muffled detonation lifted the wooden structure. Our men jumped over the parapet and rolled up the trenches to the left and to the right. Submachine guns blazed and hand grenades blasted as they knocked out the 2 emplacements. Everything had happened in a few minutes, but the fighting continued in the Russian position. We constantly heard brief bursts of automatic weapons fire, and imagined the hand-to-hand combat that was probably going on in the Russian position. Their mortars were sure to open up soon. Suddenly, the burps and explosions in the Russian position stopped. The scene was still again. I saw our team coming back, dim figures running back from the Russian bunker line and heading directly towards our position. They immediately came under fire from another machine gun the Ivans somehow had managed to mount to the left of the demolished bunker. I threw myself around and aimed at the muzzle flash of the gun. The Russian gun had to be neutralized. Bing, lying beside me, fed another belt into the MG-34. Stricker rushed up with more tracer ammunition. We fired a few more bursts, and the Russian gun stopped. Now it was high time to change our position after that most conspicuous show of our gun. Then we heard the first discharges of the Russian heavy mortars, a sequence of pop, 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 pop. Instinctively we counted each of them. Wham, 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 wham. After the first sheaf hit, we jumped up and took cover in two of the craters. The next discharges went off, and more of their shells crashed down around us. Then there were even more mortar rounds fired, and they began to merge into indistinct thunder. We were lying stiff among the blasts. This barrage was the worst I had experienced until then. Round after round came down. I don't know how long it lasted. It seemed impossible that we would escape this inferno alive or at least unhurt. And yet, lying there under the concentrated fire, our bodies pressed into the shallow craters, there was this desperate, irrepressible hope to be spared this time. For whatever we felt or hoped, we had to stay on to cover the retreat of our comrades. Last out, last in. Eventually, our 10.5-centimetre mountain howitzers made their entry and sent their rounds over to the Russian Mungo firing positions. Lifting our heads as the fire died down, we saw that so far the three of us were unhurt. In the silence that followed, another Russian flare went up. All was quiet. The assault group must be at home by now. Why didn't they give us the signal for our return? Since our departure, about half an hour had passed. Before long, it would be dawn. Suddenly, from behind, the messenger appeared and threw himself down beside me. The order was to stay on for another assault. We had lost our only prisoner through enemy fire on the way back. The battalioner was determined to get the mission accomplished nevertheless. He sent them back again, promising massive fire support. The messenger had just left when the fire of our howitzers and Mungos opened up. We saw their flashing impacts on the Russian bunker line. Our assault team made for the gap in the minefield with quick, wide jumps. Our fire stopped as suddenly as it began. Then came the clatter of small arms fire in the Russian position, but not as much as before. Could we have caught the Ivans again by surprise? It wasn't long before we saw them return, alternately jumping, taking cover, firing back, and jumping again. The machine gun opposite us remained silent this time. Our gun on the right flank blazed away toward the bunker line. Our artillery had shifted their fire to the mortar emplacements. All the same, there they were again, the dreaded discharges of the Russian Mungos. Pop, 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 pop! The terrifying swish and blast of their shells that sent us down again on our bellies. This time, however, their fire went to the rear, where they assumed the rest of our patrol was. It was dawn when the signal came for us to return. Still out on the expanse of wide-open terrain, we were all fairly visible by now. We had to cross quite a stretch to get back to the safety of our ditch. I forget how we finally made it. I only remember that the Mungo fire lasted as long as we were out in the open, and that our howitzers did their best to hold down the enemy fire. Back in the ditch and inhaling deeply on our first cigarettes, the three of us triumphed out of a sense of sheer survival rather than because of the mission's outcome, which we didn't know at that moment anyway. There was that surge of intense happiness, a temporary and utterly false feeling of physical integrity. All of this was the reverse of that fear of death we had been through during the last 2 hours. I entered the bunker to give my report. The battalioner hadn't left for his CP, but was still sitting with the patrol leader and some other men from our patrol. Among them was a Russian prisoner, rather good-looking, smoking a cigarette as he was questioned by an interpreter. They tried to extract from him fresh intelligence about an offensive our people were expecting around Easter. Here in the forward combat zone, he almost seemed to be one of us, a soldier among other soldiers and being treated as such. Our mission, I concluded, had been successful. We had 2 casualties, the messenger, who had been killed by shrapnel, and 1 man of the penal platoon, whose honour had been considered restored in the process of dying in the Russian wire entanglement. Both bodies were recovered. When I emerged from the bunker, the setting of clouds still hung unchanged in the sky in that peaceful immobility. The play of colours had begun anew. It was only in the afternoon of that day that I felt the death of the messenger sink in. Stricker and I were on our way to Shaper. The sun was falling obliquely through the sparse trees, throwing black stripes across our quiet, wintry position. In front of the medic's bunker there was an accia left on the snow, with a human shape concealed under a canvas. We stepped up to it. I knew what we would see. Stricker lifted the sheet, and now we had a full look at the waxen face of the messenger. He had a deadly wound at his neck, and his anorak was covered with frozen blood. I was deeply shocked by the sight of the comrade I had known quite well. At this instant, I fully realized that death would always be close to us, as close as our comrades next to us, and as long as we were with this unit. Now I had a full grasp of the dark side of the duty I had been so anxious to take up, and it was as if, for a short moment, my former self was standing beside me asking, "See that? How do you like it now?" From then on, deep inside, the knowledge of the imminence of death was to be my sullen companion until the end. Stricker softly put the sheet back over the messenger's face. We turned away from our dead comrade and went on, the snow crunching under our boots. Dusk would fall soon. The bark of the trees had darkened. The first trace of spring was in the air. On the 1st of June 1944, my 19th birthday, in the land northeast of Kiestinki, winter had changed to summer. For the last 2 weeks, the weather had been warm and clear, with the sun describing its low arc above the horizon for more than 20 hours a day, and bringing about the extravagant phenomena of light and the play of colour. The snow had disappeared and given way to the wilderness in all its greenness. The earth had begun to breathe again and was exhaling the fresh and rich smell of pine resin, humus, and moss. The ground was still moisture-laden, the swamps marshier than ever, breeding grounds for myriads of mosquitoes. Under the stunted birches and conifers flared a luxuriant variety of flowers and berries, tufts of grass and lichens. With the change of season, we had changed our uniforms. The thick, mostly white winter garments were replaced by speckled pattern camouflaged shirts, the warm mountain caps by the light camouflaged ones, and our helmets were worn with covers made from the same material, a special type of military gear that had become the characteristic feature of our combat units. Together with the green mosquito veils covering our faces, we had become an almost invisible part of the green wilderness. The expected Russian offensive at the end of the winter had not taken place. Now, in the swampy terrain, it was impossible to carry out any major operations. The front was quiet along the whole length of the division's sector. It was time for a respite, particularly for the squads in the bunkers whose nerves were frayed from the long months of guard duty, from their intense watching and listening in the dark. There was time for an escape from the anxiety of combat, as well as from the monotony that filled the gaps in between. We made the most of the sun that warmed the hollow behind our bunker. Sometimes, when the wind chased the mosquitoes away, we would sit there, bare to the waist in our free hours, ravenously absorbing the sunbeams and feeling some of our natural exuberance return when we closed our eyes. With our eyes open, we only had the sight of pale-skinned youths plucking lice from their shirts and tunics. That I was still among them was a near wonder. In the spring, during the thaw, I had been on my way to our old bunker to see Heinrich. It was a bright day. Instead of taking the turn around the hill, I took the direct way through the trench that had, as I have mentioned before, a dangerously shallow stretch. As I ran through the trench, only slightly stooped for cover, I suddenly felt the hiss of a bullet smacking right beside me into the dirt of the trench wall. Instantly flat on my stomach in the mud, I crawled over to the deeper stretch of the trench. When I reached my old bunker, Heinrich was horrified by my sight. "Oh my God! Are you sick? You're as pale as a tablecloth!" "Never mind," I said. "I'm fine. I just stumbled in the trench." Heinrich immediately got the picture. He'd heard the single rifle shot on this quiet morning. "I think I could do with a schnapps now," I said a bit lamely. "A big one, if you don't mind." Now, on the morning of my birthday, it was Heinrich's turn to come and see me. He brought a fine bottle of his monthly ration. We were sitting in the sun behind our bunker, drinking what was left of his bottle after it had gone around my squad. I was on leave for 24 hours. Schaeper had suggested a visit to the Soldatenheim, the division's recreation lodge. According to Heinrich, it was quite an impressive wooden structure built by our engineers. He warned me, though, "Maybe it's not what you'd expect. Go and find out for yourself." Half an hour later, I was on my way. I don't know whether it was the drink or the glorious weather or both, but I marched along our supply trail with a bounce in my step. The path wound through the woodland, up and down the hills, across swampy hollows and brooks over corduroy paths and little bridges. Again I was amazed by the Nordic sky, an immense blue arch decorated with white cumulus clouds. I had left the artillery emplacements far behind me. More and more, the tension, which had constantly racked and worn down our nerves in the front line, was evaporating and giving way to a feeling of utter release. Here, in the communications zone, the land had remained almost untouched and empty. I had been alone for the last hour or so when I met a train of pack animals on their way to the front, accompanied by 2 grooms, one trotting ahead and the other behind. Stepping aside, I let them pass, the pack animals with their relentless nodding and dainty pace, and the grooms with their round, good-natured faces that seemed to belong much more to the mules than to the combat troops. As I watched them pass, I had my submachine gun casually slung over my shoulder to emphasize the contrast of the intrepid, seasoned frontline veteran with the peaceful population of the rear echelon. In search of a lookout point, I tried a rise at some distance from the trail. From the treeless top there was a glorious view of the tranquil hills and swamps, of the glittering water of the distant lake, and of the boundless swell of the surrounding land. All of a sudden, I was struck by the pure, sincere beauty of the land, a feeling so intense and overwhelming that the anxiety, sorrow, and fear of death of the past months melted into great joy. I sat down on a rock, yielding to the spell of the moment and wanting to embrace it all. Deep inside, I knew that I had come to love this land. Alone, I let the tears roll down my cheeks. In my romantic mind, I even went so far as to think that if I was to die in this war, it would be good if it were here in the great tranquillity of this land. Recalling that day in the summer of 1944 and looking for an explanation, I think it's simply that a young soldier found a few minutes of happiness our earth sometimes provides for man, perhaps like the first hunters in North Karelia some 2,000 years ago may have felt when they roamed this wilderness for game. Hundreds of swarming mosquitoes awoke me from my exalted state. If I wanted to reach the Soldatenheim for lunch, I had to be on my way. I arrived there in time and immediately dug into a hearty meal of goulash and noodles. It wasn't too often that I could have my fill. Seldom were the rations enough for us younger ones. Afterwards, sitting there and smoking, I watched 2 Red Cross nurses working at the bar and cheerfully talking to the soldiers. Just to see real young women and to hear their soft voices plunged me into an inner turmoil. I hadn't been near any females for a long time out there. I sat in my flecked combat blouse and my not-so-clean trousers. Watching them in their immaculate light grey dresses with the white aprons and collars, and amidst the general tidiness of the place, I began to understand what Heinrich had warned me of. I felt out of place. When one of the nurses passed by my seat, so closely that she brushed my face with her dress, I was thrown into complete confusion. I quickly got up and fled into the cinema. As I watched the newsreel, my overall impression was that things were going badly in the east. There still were impressive images of our panzer units and infantry in action, but for the first time I was struck by the inherent propaganda. It wasn't so much the pictures that showed real combat scenes, but rather the unnaturally excited voices of the accompanying text. Contrary to the intention of the propagandists, the impression that registered was one of falseness, of fabrication. The show went on, under the title, "It was an exuberant ball night." The film that followed was about Tchaikovsky and his relationship with Nadezhda Filaretovna. It was conceived as a bittersweet romance, accompanied by Tchaikovsky's music. Obviously, I was ill-prepared for both, particularly for the music. After months of total musical destitution, I was ready for emotional release. I felt sorry for Peter Ilyich, I felt sorry for Nadezhda Filaretovna, and I felt sorry for myself. So, toward the end of the film, Tchaikovsky, already stricken with cholera, was directing his Pathétique, and when the last movement, the huge wave of the Adagio Lamentoso, surged up, a tearjerker even under normal conditions, I felt again a lump in my throat and rescued myself by leaving the theatre in a hurry. Outside in the sun, the morbid scenes soon vanished. I wanted to be back in the real world, back to my mission. I went to get some food and sweets for my way back. I would take my time, and I would take a long rest up on my lookout and watch the sun go down. It was a week after the summer solstice when the Russians finally launched their offensive. At first, we heard the faint rumble of artillery fire up at the north flank. Then an artillery barrage came down on the positions of SS Mountain Infantry Regiment 12, our neighbour to the left. It was of such tremendous energy that, in the following attack, strong Russian forces actually broke into the regiment's forward positions. They nevertheless were thrown out in the ensuing counterattack. Under the cover of more artillery fire, however, the Ivans managed to dig new positions dangerously close to our front line. We answered with a massive artillery bombardment, using all the howitzers and heavy mortars at the division's disposal. In the end, the Russians withdrew. Even with all the casualties this operation had cost both sides, it was only a harbinger of greater events to come. The thunder on the north flank continued, to worry all of us for the next few days. The first rumours came in. The brave Norwegians of Ski Battalion Norway had been overrun and driven from their outpost. Other strong points seemed to have been abandoned, among them the one from which we had started our mission to the lakes in March. The thought that Manhard was somehow involved in what was going on added to my uneasiness as I listened to the constant rumble. Had he been with the outposts that had been overrun? Was he still alive? Over the days, the thunder had increased rather than lessened. It didn't stop at night, but there were no nights anyway. They said even Stukas were employed. Something big was going on up there. In the rear, we found the regimental command post bustling with activity as the battalion assembled. Sergeants major were directing different units here and there. Equipment was being replaced and completed. Rations for several days were issued. Finally, our platoon stood in line for an extra item handed out from a desk standing under some fir trees, a round tin box of Coca-Cola for each of us. Such charity was an unmistakable sign that things were getting serious. I remember clearly the scene I was watching. There, for the first time, I saw the men of our platoon all together, chatting, relaxed, clad in their camouflage blouses, their caps taken off for the light breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay, their faces tanned from the sunny weather of the recent weeks. I saw Bing, the ever-reliable one, with his machine gun resting on his shoulder, Stricker with his blonde shock of hair, Polzer, the other South Tyrolean of my gun crew, red-cheeked and strong as a mule, Berger with his good square worker's face, the Alte and his men laughing about one of his jokes, Schmidtchen, the easiest one to entertain, Baumer, and next to him Heinrich with his machine gun on his shoulder showing a wry smile. I suddenly felt pride and confidence in this unit, in the battalion as a whole, which at that moment seemed to me invincible. At some distance the trucks were waiting for us to embark. Standing tightly packed on the open backs while the convoy slowly turned onto the road, we saw a figure standing on the porch of his log cabin seeing us off. That figure was our division commander, with silvery oak leaves on his collar patches. He was a small, wiry figure, thoughtfully looking at the 2nd Battalion he was sending up to the north flank in support of the hard-pressed defenders of Senozero. In each tin box of Coca-Cola were 2 discs of dark chocolate enriched with caffeine. These tin boxes were pure luxury for us. It was midnight. Ahead of us was the road, that bold wooden construction leading north. It followed the ups and downs of the terrain as a sailing boat would ride the waves. Whenever we were on top of a hillock and before the vehicles dove down again, we had the strange sight of the road forming a straight row of treeless humps that stretched up to the horizon. And right there in the north, as a huge red disk, the sun was about to rise for another day of combat. The road ended at Okunyeva Guba, a hamlet, actually only a few huts, on a peninsula between 2 arms of the Yeletsozero. It was quite near to our own artillery emplacements, as we could tell from the incessant noise of their discharges. We started to cross the peninsula on a narrow path further north. It was strenuous work with all the heavy gear on us as we worked our way across the spongy ground. The undergrowth on both sides was thick. The mosquitoes began to torment us again. Our progress was slow. For some reason, again and again, the line came to a halt. Then we would put down our weapons and ammunition boxes and throw ourselves down beside the path for a short break. Suddenly, the distant heavy weapons were silent for a while. Once again we waited for the line to move on, unaware of what was coming toward us. The first thing we noticed was the snorting of the mules up ahead on the trail, and then their flickering ears above the brushwood. As they emerged, they disclosed, one after another, the load that lay across the back of each of them, our dead comrades of SS Reconnaissance Battalion 6, recovered from the combat zone toward which we were heading. Gently swinging with the pace of the mules, their faces softly touching the flanks of the animals, seemingly unharmed in their camouflage blouses, their limp bodies looked completely exhausted rather than dead. In fact, it was only the unnatural whiteness of their hands dangling from their blouses that unmistakably showed that death was real. It was a long column of 25 to 30 animals, with one body draped across each animal. All of us rose and removed our caps and veils. We let the slow procession pass in utter silence. Behind the mules, a train of stretcher-bearers followed. On their shoulders, they carried critically wounded men. The bearers were dripping with sweat, mumbling curses as they once again stumbled or sank deep into the swampy ground. Eventually, the way was cleared. We took up our gear and marched on. Having reached the edge of the lake, we waited for the ferry to take us to the other side. Heinrich and I were sitting at the foot of a tree, Heinrich chipping a wooden stick with his puko. The other men of the platoon were scattered around the little landing stage with its small stock of ammunition boxes, fodder for the mules, and gasoline for the boats. We were watching the ferry as it glided towards us. It cut a wide triangle on the smooth surface, which reflected the sky with all the fancy colours of this early hour. With the continuing lull in the artillery fire, we could hear the soft hum of the motor. A single figure stood at the stern of the raft-like structure, operating the tiller. It was a scene of absolutely compelling symbolism. I couldn't help saying to Heinrich, "Look at the ferryman. It's Karen conveying the poor souls across the river Styx. What have we got for an obolus to give him when it's our time?" Instantly I realized that I had missed the light touch I originally intended. He forced a smile. "When the hour comes," he said, "we'll have given all we had. Don't worry, he will understand." When the ferry was moored, it was plain to see that help was needed to bring the cargo ashore. More bodies lay in a row, concealed under speckled canvases. Myth had turned into reality. The mules would soon be back. On the opposite edge of the lake there were the boats. They were quite inconspicuous at first, 3 oblong, flat-bottomed shells of about 4 meters, lying on the ground upside down, square stern, pointed at the bow, made of light metal and painted green. Next to them were the 3 motors, 2 massive cylinder blocks sticking out on both sides of, and mounted on, the upper end of a long drive shaft. The engine had a large handle in front and a propeller on the rear end of the shaft. These were the kind of boats featured in the newsreels, with assault teams deeply ducked into the shell, charging some hostile bank in a roaring, rapid sweep across the water and leaving a huge tail wave behind. We were waiting for the guide to bring us to Senozero. Meanwhile, we stood around the boats to take a closer look. There was some idle talk, some of us wondering why this valuable equipment was just lying about when we were interrupted. "Listen, everyone!" Shaper was calling from the edge of the wood, where he stood next to an engineer sergeant and an officer. Both seemed to have come down from the front line. We gathered around them. "Untersturmführer Manhard of the Reconnaissance Battalion is going to explain to you our next mission," Shaper said, and stepped back, leaving it to Manhard to continue. "Parts of your battalion and ours will mount another breakthrough across the Senozero at 7 this morning. I repeat, 7 o'clock. The units will reinforce the battalions that are encircled on the other side of Senozero, in a bridgehead, in fact. In the same action, our casualties will be brought out. We need your heavy machine guns to reinforce the covering fire from this side of the lake. The breakthrough will be carried out by the 3 boats we've already got up there, and by the 3 of them still lying here. That means we'll have to bring them to the lake in time. It's in Greek mythology, Charon was the ferryman who took the dead across the river Styx that formed the border to the underworld. For the fair, people would put an obol into the mouth of the body being transported. It's 7 kilometers from here. None of your own equipment will be left behind. We'll need every gun, every ammunition belt, every rifle we've got. It's a difficult stretch, and I know it's going to be rough for all of you, but it can be done as it has been done before. He looked at his watch. It's high time. Let's get going. I looked around. There were only our 2 platoons assembled on the narrow lake shore. If there were 6 men for each boat, and say 5 men for each engine, there would be only half of our manpower left to carry our normal equipment. Listening to Manhard's briefing, I was impressed by his capacity to inspire others with a sense of duty and confidence. This young officer, in his worn battle dress and with his face marked by the strain of the ongoing battle, was undeniably one of us, someone to go through fire and water for. Somehow we managed to pick men of equal height for the boats and the sturdier ones, such as Polzer and Berger, for the motors. The extra weapons and ammunition boxes were strapped to the breasts and backs of the rest of the men. We left the shore without delay. The path wound through a terrain of solid ground, swamps and brooks, the impassable parts reinforced by corduroy trails and sometimes small bridges. This supply route satisfied the needs of normal movements for mountain infantry and mules, but it was entirely unfit for our task. The boats were much wider than the beaten track, and most of the narrow corduroy structures on the ground. Feeling the painful pressure of the gunwale on our shoulders, and mostly walking beside the path, we were anxious to avoid any slip, which could be disastrous for the team. Crossing the first swamp on the corduroy path, we shifted the load from our inner to our outer shoulders, ducking our heads under the shell of the boat, guided only by the 2 men at the bow. The motor teams were better off, as 4 men each carried the cylinder blocks resting on 2 poles parallel to the shaft, so that 2 men could walk closely together, a 5th man carrying the rear end. The others, walking in line on the trail, carried the heaviest loads, their shoulders and knees bent by the weight of the equipment. After half an hour of balancing our boat along the track, we heard a loud, sharp curse and saw the boat ahead of us crash down to the ground. Instantly we put down our boat, glad for the interruption. As it turned out, 2 men had slipped from the poles on the ground and landed knee-deep in the bog, causing the boat to topple over. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Shaper, arriving from the rear and packed with ammo boxes himself, saw that the men were already desperate and near exhaustion. The sun had risen above the treetops, and swarms of mosquitoes were drawn by our sweat. It was almost unbearable that we had gone only a small part of our way. "Come on, get going, don't lose contact. We'll take a break soon," Shaper said as he helped lift our boats onto our shoulders. The others took up their loads, and the train started to move again. From then on, swamps and small elevations alternated, testing our energy and patience. Coming out of a bog, we were relieved to have solid ground under our feet, but then we had to stumble uphill over rocks and stumps. We took occasional breaks, but it became increasingly difficult to lift our loads again and continue our struggle. Manhard, the engineer sergeant, and Shaper spotted those who stumbled and had trouble getting back on their feet. They managed to provide some relief by exchanging one of the men under the gunwales or taking over an ammunition box for a while. This mission was pushing us to the limit. Our hearts pounded like pistons, and our carotid arteries stuck out of our necks like rubber tubes gleaming with sweat. The ever-gnawing pain from the gunwales, the poles, and the straps tormented our shoulders. If only our feet could find firm and even ground. Instead, we had to endure obstacles and spongy sod beside the path, slipping in the bog. Whenever that happened, all kinds of temperaments surfaced. Aggression, curses in various dialects and volumes, the South Tyrolean sounding like an unintelligible, high-pitched rush of words to the ears of all others. And then again, quiet composure or endurance. In the end, nothing mattered anymore but our tortured bodies mustering their last reserves to overcome exhaustion and our wild determination to deliver the boats to Senozero on time. We didn't care about the harassing fire from the Russian artillery that increased as we progressed. We had become indifferent to our own combat action lying ahead of us. We had also forgotten about the column of dead we had watched earlier that morning. Meanwhile, the boat teams marched independently, each entirely occupied with managing on their own. The intervals between our breaks became shorter and shorter. Manhard, like a sheepdog, kept herding the train together, encouraging us and reassuring us that we were almost there. Somehow, after 2.5 hours, we reached the landing place behind a rise that stretched along the south edge of Senozero. Numbed with exhaustion, we delivered the boats and the motors to the engineers, slammed ourselves into a bay that provided cover from the artillery fire, and lay prostrate on the ground, draining our canteens in long gulps. I was called in for a briefing and looked at my watch. 6 o'clock. Still 1 hour to go. I looked for an opportunity to speak with Manhard before he left and before we were emplaced in our firing positions. I found him preparing for his mission. He was going with Hansen, our battalion commander, who had been appointed to relieve the wounded commander of the enclosed strongpoint and to take charge of our Kampfgruppe in the pocket. The men inside had been suffering for days from massive artillery and mortar fire and holding their ground against continuous enemy attacks. Manhard said that the Russians had briefly overrun some outer positions and even advanced to the command post, but had eventually been thrown out in hand-to-hand fighting. As things stood, Hansen's new assignment seemed to be a Himmelfahrtskommando. Manhard pointed to a group of officers getting ready to embark on boats that were to form the first wave. Hansen was among them, looking just like one of us in his helmet, camouflage blouse, and a submachine gun hanging from his shoulder. Another was our battalion surgeon,